So today we're looking at speaking about how consumer experience can be improved in the Indian electricity sector. And what I do notice with our audience today is we are primarily a lot of people who work firsthand with electricity consumers. And I think that it's a very fruitful exercise to be speaking about enhancing their experience right now, because primarily everyone that in the audience today is some way or the other very closely working with consumers who on a daily basis consume electricity. So once again, thank you very much to all our speakers who've joined us today and taking their time out and to speak to us. Before we begin, I would like to introduce a Citizen, Consumer and Civic Action Group and the kind of work that we do at CAG. We've been in consumer support and consumer activism for over 35 years now. We were established in 1985. We work in several different verticals and streams, and one of the prominent ones being electricity. Apart from that, we also focus on solid waste management, sustainable transport, urban governance, and primarily all things consumerism. So this is a little brief about what CAG has been doing. Specifically in terms of electricity and the kind of consumer engagement that CAG has with electricity consumers, I'd like to introduce Electricity Consumer Cells, which is our initiative that has been going on for over 5 years. And this is an exercise where we have about 7 different districts which are working along with CAG, 7 different organizations in 7 different districts working along with CAG to handle consumer complaints around electricity, to explain and resolve their issues for them, be a bridge between electricity officials and consumers who have complaints around electricity. These consumer cells are in about 7 districts in Tamil Nadu. And they also try and work on creating awareness and enhancing consumer participation in the electricity sector. So as an exercise today, talking about how we can promote consumers' participation and experience in the Indian electricity sector, I think will be a very solid takeaway for all our participants who are also, some of them from ECCs have joined us as well. So thank you all for joining today. As the first step, I would like to welcome our speakers, Mr. Mahesh Patnakar, Yuvan Power, and Professor Priya Yadav. I think she's yet to join us. So to begin with, I'd like to hand over this the virtual floor to Mr. Mahesh.
Thank you, Pavitra, and thank you, Vishnu, and the entire team at CAG. Really glad to be here, and this is a very important topic of discussion, especially given the kind of transition that we are seeing happening in the electricity space. So Pavitra, just a logistics request. So can I share my screen and move my slides from here, please?
Sure, that works.
Yeah. Great. Please confirm if you're able to see my screen.
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. So so it's a very important topic of discussion, and especially given the fact that we are transitioning towards a different era in the electricity sector. Electricity sector, as electrons, is a very dynamic sector, and India has seen substantial changes in the power sector during the past several years and several decades. And one of the important change that happened in the power markets in India was the enactment of Electricity Act 2003, which really consolidated several things that are being done and what we are seeing happening today. And as a service provision, I think it is important for us to sort of take on board that the consumer is at the front and center of this entire activity. I again thank CAG for having invited us. Just a few lines on Indian Systems. We are a niche energy and environment sector consulting and advisory firm, and we work very closely with different utilities in the country, regulatory commissions, several private sector entities who are involved in bringing in innovations in the power sector, electricity sector, as well as the energy sector in general. We also work quite a bit in the transportation sector in the regulation space, and at the same time also related to the electric vehicle charging, infrastructure policies, and siting studies, and so on. We are one of the key sort of new entrants in the consumer activities that are being promoted at CAG, and really glad that Vishnu and his team has given us this opportunity to be a part of this wider discussion. So coming back to the presentation, I think it's important for us to understand, and everyone to understand, the customer is supposed to be a king. And this is sort of said in, talked about any commodity and the service provision market. But the real question here is, are the customers really treated as kings in the power sector? Because specifically in the power sector, unlike in the transportation sector, or unlike the telecom sector, the competition is not a lot. So we basically see several monopolistic entities, specifically in the transmission and distribution sector, that are sort of important part of this entire power sector stakeholder ecosystem. And because of that, because of the entire monopolistic behavior, the customers are not really treated as kings. So there are obviously certain customers who are treated differently than the others, and that's exactly what we all together firstly need to discuss. Also talk about what are the different opportunities that the customers have in the current era. And then given the fact that the substantial level of transition that's happening in the Indian electricity sector, I think it's an important opportunity for us to leverage that position and come in this discussion with a position of strength, and then really create some sort of a good partnership between the public sector distribution companies, private sector distribution companies, and the consumers. So in the time to come, we will definitely see a situation where the consumer side of things, as well as the electricity market, which is primarily the electricity providers, such as the distribution licensees in India as they are defined, they need to work hand in hand to create a better experience for the consumers, and at the same time to reduce the overall systemic cost and the societal cost. And reducing the societal cost actually leads us to some of the important opportunities that we are seeing in the market itself, wherein what you really see is essentially three sort of stakeholder groups that are involved in this process. One is the consumer group. Second one is the electricity service providers group, which is the distribution licensees. You also have the generation companies. You also have the transmission companies, and that's the stakeholder group that we're talking about when we talk about electricity service providers. And then you have the governments and the regulators. So obviously, governments and regulators are involved and at the front and center of making policies, enacting policies, making legislations, and then helping and protecting the consumer interest, at the same time giving enough impetus to the service providers. So as governments and the regulators, their job is not to favor only one part of the stakeholder group, but their job is also to create some kind of a balance between what is required for the electricity service providers to be in the business, and at the same time to make sure that the consumers really get what India defines as a universal service obligation in the distribution sector. So the electricity as a service provided to the consumers is absolutely a fundamental right. So there should not be any kind of difference between a large industry and a small and medium-scale enterprise that is operating in the field, or a very high-rise residential consumer and someone who's sort of staying in sort of a village in a very small hutment. Both this spectrum do really have the right to get the commodity. And what is important from the consumer's perspective is to ensure that the commodity, which is electricity in this case, is reliable and affordable, coming from the distribution licenses without any kind of favoritism that we would see in certain types of the consumer base. And this favoritism actually comes also because of the political interferences and also the political economy of the entire sector. In certain sectors, you'll see that the consumers from the commercial and industrial base really speaking pay high. And it's always sort of commented that consumers in the agriculture sector do not really pay. But the question that I always like to ask is, if the agricultural consumers are not really paying for the electricity, are they really getting the electricity when they want? So there are several reforms and newer thinking that's going into that's happening in the electricity sector in India, which is coming to the rescue of consumers in different spectrum. So to give certain examples, you have the solarization of agriculture feeders as one of the key aspect of the electricity sector that we are seeing during the that we have been seeing during the past 2 to 3 years. And what's really happening is the daytime power, which was not essentially available in the past to the agriculture consumer, is now being made available to the agriculture consumers. So the burden of the subsidy, which is coming onto the entire rate base, is actually getting reduced because of those kinds of policies. That's the first thing. Second thing is, fortunately, India has taken on to itself a very high target of renewable energy, something close to 450 gigawatts to be generated by 2030. And what's important is there is a clear role for the rooftop photovoltaic systems that's available. And then if you talk about the rooftop PV systems, it's important that we cannot neglect the industries, small and mid-scale enterprises, small commercial establishments, and the large commercial establishments, as much as we focus on the ground-mounted utility scale systems. We also need to understand how the tariffs are sort of set up. And I'm sure that several folks on this webinar today already know about this, but I thought it's important for us to understand this cascade, wherein you clearly have power procurement cost, which comprises of somewhere close to 75 to 80% of the tariff that we pay to the electricity distribution company. And then you have some regulated approved return on equity. And return on equity is essentially applied on the capital expenditure made by the distribution licenses to set up distribution transformers, to have cables coming up to your connection, service connection, cost of the meters, so on and so forth. And then there are also certain electricity duty and taxes that are captured by the system, and then there are administration costs. So if you really look at what's happening here, is basically whatever gets generated in terms of the power procurement gets transferred to the consumers by way of tariff. And as I mentioned earlier, close to 75 to 80% of the overall tariff that is paid by the consumers to the distribution licensees is coming from the power procurement cost. So I think that's a very important aspect for us to consider, wherein if we have any kind of alternative opportunities to have low cost power that the distribution licenses can procure, I think that certainly will be in favor of the consumers, because it will lead to reduced tariffs. But we also need to understand that the power procurement cost, there is some kind of a long-term tie-up that's already happened between different distribution licensees and the power generations. And something called as a power procurement agreement is something which essentially comes in the way of procuring that power in the long term. And fortunately, in India, we are now seeing the transformation of the power procurement practices itself. Just to give you an example from the state of Maharashtra, the utilities in the city of Mumbai, four utilities, actually came together and created some kind of a power procurement group. And they actually move towards procuring the power based on some merit order. And that is something which is now being mandated by any kind of all the regulatory commissions. And even in case of Tamil Nadu, which has a very high level of renewable energy, primarily wind generation, the law now requires that there is a must-run status to be offered to the renewable energy procurement. And in several cases, you will see and realize that the cost of overall power procurement will go down the moment we now start looking at the renewable energy. Gone are the days when we had the power procurement costs from the renewable energy to the level of 12 rupees per kilowatt hour or 15 rupees a kilowatt hour. That's changed entirely. Now, what we are seeing is the power procurement the cost going down. But again, it's a transition. There are already certain legacy contracts that have been signed between the distribution licensees and the generators. And we need to wait for certain time period for those contracts to cease to exist. In the recent past, just like a couple of weeks ago, the Punjab State Electricity Regulatory Commission gave a very interesting order that allowed the incumbent local distribution licensee to get out of a contract which was a legacy contract which they had signed 25 years ago. So that was a very interesting sort of opportunity that was made available to the distribution licensing. Now, the consumers also need to sort of understand the electricity market a little bit differently. So one of the points that we are trying to focus during this part of the webinar is basically to talk a little bit about the small and medium scale enterprises and the industries, as well as the domestic consumers. And we'll have other speakers focusing on the rural electrification. But let's focus only on the demand, let's focus only on the industries and the small and medium scale enterprises, which get exposed to something that we call as demand charges. And these demand charges are essentially whatever is the connected load, which is the guarantee and the insurance that they get from the incumbent distribution licensee to get that power whether they require. But the general sort of structure in which we have seen that happening is if you require, let's assume, say 250 kilowatt of or 250 kVA power, the SMEs tend to tie up nothing less than 500 or half a megawatt of electricity, just with the fear that if they expand subsequently, they should not be in a situation where they are not able to draw power from the electricity grid. And that actually exposes them to higher level of demand charges. And then there are several other sort of opportunities available to the industries and the commercial sector as well, in the form of time of use tariffs and the time of the day tariffs. And in several cases, this get neglected. Why do this get neglected? Firstly, because the arbitrage between the normal tariff and the rebate that they get if they use it during the off-peak hours, and the penalty that they end up paying if they use during the peak hours or on-peak hours is something which is not well understood by the SMEs and the industrial sector. And they are in the business of production. They are in the business of providing a service in a restaurant or a hotel and so on, or a hospital. So for them to stagger their loads just to get the benefits from the time of use and the time of the day tariffs is not that easy. So the consumers, in short, need to understand that their electricity bills a lot better, and if possible, they need to plan their production processes as well as the occupancy planning and so on to meet the requirements of the on-peak demand as well as off-peak demand that they get exposed to. And there is a particular way in which they can essentially sort of optimize their overall power procurement cost itself. There are huge opportunities coming through the renewable energy, and then here I actually want to focus on the rooftop PV policies. I think even Tamil Nadu has a rooftop PV policy. There are several states, almost all the states in the country have rooftop PV policies. But we usually sort of always hear this complaint that there are certain SMEs and small commercial establishments who want to go for a rooftop photovoltaic systems, but they need to approach the incumbent distribution licensee and then get permissions to establish their own rooftop PV systems, including the batteries. And there is a sort of a general notion that we don't get the permissions and so on. So from the consumer's perspective, and in order to facilitate this entire process, it's also very important for some entity to facilitate that process so that more and more rooftop photovoltaic systems will come online. And then one of the key barriers that some of the distribution licenses may be facing is imagine a large industry or even a small industry which goes for its own solar photovoltaic and the rooftop photovoltaic system. That's actually a loss of revenue and loss of cash on table as far as the distribution licenses are concerned. And that's the reason wherein we see some of the barriers being created in certain systems. But we need to sort of change this equation and then actually move forward with some kind of alternative business structures. So how about the consumers and the incumbent distribution licenses coming together and creating certain business models which will allow certain kinds of investments to be made jointly by the consumers and the distribution licenses in rooftop PV systems as well as batteries and so on. I'll quickly move to the domestic sector. Again, in the domestic sector, we have exactly similar situation where several slabs that have been identified in different regulatory commissions and different states allow for some kind of an optimization if you remain lesser in terms of your monthly consumption, and that lesser amount is basically compared to the highest tariff or highest slab tariff that you get exposed to. So, for example, in Maharashtra, if you're using anywhere above 300 kilowatt hour, you really pay highest tariff in the domestic sector, and that's something which we can essentially avoid, and that avoidance can happen only if we again sensitize the consumers start using some kind of home automation systems or smart metering systems that can actually give them certain triggers that you're likely to exceed this threshold. And in order to save your cost, it will be prudent to start sort of optimizing your energy consumption and electricity consumption. I want to sort of talk about a very interesting opportunity in the SMEs as well as the domestic sector that we are seeing. So there are several opportunities to firstly either conserve energy, which means don't use energy, or use energy in an efficient manner, which we call as energy efficiency. Then you have renewable energy, which is nothing else but your effort to decarbonize your energy consumption itself. And then you also have the battery energy systems, energy storage systems. So a combination of energy efficiency, renewable energy, battery energy storage systems, and also demand response techniques is something which will help different consumers as well as the distribution companies to work together. And here, I think demand response is a very important opportunity, as we are going to see a lot of renewable energy that's going to come into the system. So in the past, what we typically saw in the power planning is you have the load that is growing and the peak demand is growing. And in order to meet that peak demand, you end up having more and more generation plants. But now the situation is flipped entirely. So we are seeing rooftop PV systems, wind, biomass, and several renewable energy opportunities that we are seeing in the market. So essentially, the way in which we are generating and at the time at which we are generating, the load centers can essentially follow the generation. So gone are the days where the generation would follow the load, but I think we are entering an era where the load can start following the generation. And that is something which is possible through different levels of aggregation. And this aggregation can offer different benefits to the SME clusters or even the domestic clusters, wherein one can look at bulk procurement of power, one can look at bulk procurement of the rooftop PV systems, and reduce the sort of burden on the thermal generation and sort of really move forward with all sorts of renewable energy. And then there are new techniques that are also quite possible in the foreseeable future, which deal with the peer-to-peer trading and also peer-to-peer learning from optimization of the electricity consumption. So this is what I had to share. I have my colleagues also online here, Meghna, Prajakta, Priyanka, and Smita. And back to you, Pavitra. We'll be glad to take any questions that you may have and also contribute in further deliberations. So back to you. I'll stop sharing my screen so that we can take the control back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mahesh. So far we had Mr. Mahesh, the founder and MD at MPEN System, speaking to us about the urban context, the role of SME and the domestic consumer as we know it in the electricity sector. So thank you, sir. I did notice that there was someone who raised their hand. Ms.
We can keep it for later, Pavitra.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so Vishnu, maybe you can take it forward from here. I do have Devon's presentation.
When I saw Mahesh's presentation, I think I should let the others speak, and I'll be the last one to have a shot, give a kind of overview also. I think that'll be better. I think.
So I'm going to request Devon to take over next. I'm going to share your screen, share the screen for your presentation right now.
Thank you. Thanks very much. If you could, I think that's the second slide. There's a slide at it doesn't really matter, I don't think, though, because I think the one prior is just the cover. But thank you to Priya and Vishnu for inviting Village Energy to present today. Thank you to CAG. What I'd like to take you through is essentially who we are, so who Village Energy are, what we're currently working to achieve, and what we've implemented in a pilot project in Andhra Pradesh that's working to enhance consumer experience, but also balance that with benefits to discoms as well. You can move to the next slide, thank you. So Village Energy is an Australian-based energy technology company. We've got a vision for helping communities thrive, and we do that by using a combination of hardware and software. So we've developed a platform that improves energy supply at the last mile of the grid. And what we mean by the last mile of the grid is really anything below a low voltage transformer. And we partner directly with discoms and with the sub-licensees. And we do that to make energy more visible for them, but much more sustainable and inclusive. We've placed as well a real emphasis on sharing value with customers, and that's obviously the consumers below that low voltage transformer, and prosumers as well, where they've installed things like rooftop PV. And we use energy as well as a catalyst to provide real social and economic development opportunities for communities. Next slide, thank you. I'm actually one of 3 co-founders at Village Energy. As I mentioned, we're based over in Western Australia. I'm presenting to you today from Perth in Western Australia. And Village Energy has been around for around 3 years, and India was our initial market. We've been operating in India for a while. And the co-founders have come together from a number of different backgrounds, but all with an energy background, and working across the Australian outback, which are some of the most isolated and remote systems in the world. But what we've developed is a platform that really tries to implement a consumer-centric way of improving outcomes for customers and really democratizing the energy system. Next slide, thanks. As I mentioned, we've been in India for a number of years. Western Australia is actually the sister state to Andhra Pradesh, which was where we began our India operations. I like to show this photo because it really puts the problem that we're working to resolve into context. It was our CEO that took this photo when he visited a substation in southern India. And the engineer that you see in this photo was speaking with my CEO, and he got a phone call and was told to reduce demand. So he picked up a bamboo pole and he used it to shed an entire feeder. So that's probably around 3,000 households that have lost power. And what we try to do with our installation, with our technology, is to help avoid this and bring efficiency and resiliency to the energy system. So the past few years have seen obviously some major developments. Mahesh was talking about those in terms of the distribution sector and the utility sector in India. But there's still a lot of challenges, and there's also some huge opportunities. Sorry, just getting some background noise there. But there's still a lot of challenges, and there's also some opportunities for discoms to continue to improve. And we know that most distribution utilities are making major losses at the moment because of expenses. We've spoken about the long-term PPAs that they're obviously signed into. We've got obviously varying degrees of infrastructure. Some infrastructure obviously in rural and remote areas is reasonably poor in condition, and the operational efficiencies, obviously there's room for improvement. So there's a lot of challenges facing discoms, and this is a real cyclical problem for them, because obviously with these losses, this in turn prevents them from making the investments required to improve the quality of the energy system overall and begin to prepare for what will be a much wider penetration of renewable energy and distributed energy resources. Next slide, thank you. So in India and globally, the energy model is shifting. We know that it's moving away from larger centralized fossil fuel burning assets to millions of small and inexpensive resources that are sitting at the edge of the energy grid, such as rooftop solar, batteries, electric vehicles, and smart appliances as well. So this world is really a hyper-local and very different type of energy system. Sorry, I just had a phone call then. I hope I'm still, you can still hear me okay. Customers are beginning to invest in these assets in quite and these assets as well aren't necessarily ones that are going to be owned by the discoms. They're going to sit behind the meter. So they're going to present unique challenges for distribution companies, and they're going to be different types of resources in that they'll be variable and intermittent, meaning that their performance will change at any given time. So there really needs to be a way to manage and improve the technical performance of the grid. And at the same time, this needs to be underpinned with a way to prioritise cheaper or greener energy sources that can optimise outcomes for customers and obviously environmental and economic outcomes. Next slide, thank you. So at the moment, we're seeing some really interesting megatrends that are all really converging to change how energy utilities will ultimately begin to engage with consumers. We've got obviously an accelerated uptake of residential scale rooftop solar and batteries. There's still obviously some barriers, but I think over time we'll still continue to see those sorts of assets being installed in greater numbers. Households now as well, obviously smartphone penetration is almost universal, and there are a lot of consumers that are embracing new technologies and things like home automation, which is underpinned by artificial intelligence. And what we've seen as well with COVID-19 is an acceleration of digital engagement and digital adoption. So when it comes to energy, just putting a smart meter into the field obviously addresses some problems, but I think it misses some of the opportunities to engage with customers and prosumers in a new way. And I think by shifting decision-making and logic to the edge of the grid, discoms can involve customers and their assets to support the energy grid in new ways. And this is really a transition that's underway globally at the moment, and it's quite revolutionary for the energy sector. And it's going to require things like real-time energy management and exchange, low cost and automated control of assets, consumers' input and their ability to control their preferences and how energy can be used. And obviously it's going to need to be underpinned by things like big data and artificial intelligence and patterns of consumption to optimize a much more clean energy mix into the future and lower access to lower cost forms of energy that still provide consumers with reliability and the types of experiences that they would like to receive. Next slide, thank you. So I'll talk now about what Village Energy has developed. So we've built a digital platform to address a lot of these challenges, and we've built it specifically for markets like India. And it blends a combination of hardware and software and uses data to transform the grid edge into an opportunity for discoms and sub-licensees. So we've designed a smart meter that has all of the basic features of a standard smart meter, but it also is able to process distributed logic, so it can make decisions and it can control circuits, which obviously is a bit of a game changer for the industry model. And our platform consists of an end user app as well. So we give consumers access to information about their energy use. We can support either pre or post payment options and the ability for consumers to set preferences around their use of energy. And discoms can view and manage the system quite easily through an admin console. And they can interact with customers in real time and provide things like payment incentives for customers' activities that support the energy system. And all of these interactions can be automated as well, so the solution is highly scalable. Next slide, thank you. We have got a pilot project in Andhra Pradesh that's fully implemented, where we've implemented this solution and the end-to-end stack of features. What we've seen when we've implemented this technology is some really quite transformational results. So we've been able to reduce the cost per kilowatt hour for the discom by around 30%. We've reduced grid outages by 75% and peak load by 13%. And we've increased the amount of clean energy into that grid at any time by up to 50%. So, and we've completed along the way as well a number of surveys. So we conducted a baseline survey prior to implementing the technology, and then we measured social and technical performance throughout the pilot project, both inside and outside of our project area, so that we could be confident on the results that we were delivering. Next slide, thank you. In addition to the system benefits that we've been able to deliver to the discom, we've also been able to deliver some social impact outcomes, such as lower customer bills. So we've lowered them by an average of around 9%. I've mentioned the reduction in outages, which is obviously particularly important for consumers. And we've also seen things like an increase in productive appliance purchases. So, and those sorts of productive appliances are obviously quite important for individuals and households, things like refrigeration, grinders and water pumps, which really help reduce domestic workloads as well for women and girls. And these are really genuine socio-economic outcomes that we've been able to quantify in addition to the economic benefits that we can deliver to the discoms. Next slide, thank you. I think at the moment, many energy providers and discoms are really struggling through an awkward or reactive renegotiation of the customer's role in the energy system. Meanwhile, we see customers who are embracing new technologies and are often left frustrated or underwhelmed by their discom's ability to meet their expectations. So what we try to do with our platform is to dramatically improve customer engagement options across the customer journey, right the way from onboarding and awareness through to retention and advocacy. And once a meter is installed, we do this really by a customer basically can download, it's as simple as downloading an app and onboarding their meter, and they do that by scanning a QR code. We can help customers to do this if they need assistance as well, so we can do it at the point of the meter install. And the onboarding process includes identifying household connections and setting preferences around energy use. And then we can support the Discom to offer them new or innovative tariffs or plans, which can help support conversations around regulatory reform. We've already spoken about time of day or time of use tariffs. And customers, once they've set preferences, the control of those connections is automated, so they're able to just set and forget. And customers can then manage their own account as well through the app and do things like easily pay their bills, as I mentioned, either through pre or post payment. And we do this via a payment gateway that we've set up through the app. So customers can see their bill and they can make payments basically in whatever increment they want, how frequently they want. And we're able to also offer them things like finance for productive appliances or rooftop solar, which can be paid down via the app as well. We also have things like chat and notifications for customers, so they can easily be informed about grid events or reminded to do things like pay bills, or when a prepayment credit might be getting low. And all of these interactions can also be automated using artificial intelligence, so the engagement happens when it's most relevant for that consumer. Next slide, thank you. The customers, really for them, these are a series of app screens that we've just snapshot, and I know they'll be quite difficult to see, but this is really just to illustrate what it looks like from a customer perspective. Obviously, we have as well customers that are less digitally literate. They might not be comfortable to use an app, and all of these app screens can be translated into local language. But that said, some customers obviously will still have basic phones or maybe not own a phone at all. So we do have things like local agents and kiosks that can help support people with making payments or setting preferences. And we can also do things like send messages in local language to basic phones via SMS. And we have a toll-free number that consumers can call if they need support. But ultimately, we're aiming to use this platform to simplify the customer journey by anticipating and automating touch points, but doing it in a way that it provides benefits to the Discom as well, such as improving metering and billing, in grid automation, and enhancing operating efficiencies. Next slide, thank you. We've measured customer satisfaction throughout our pilot project, because obviously this is a really key indicator of how well the technology is working and how receptive consumers are to engaging in these new ways. And on average, we had a net promoter score of around plus 78, which is higher than a lot of other digital platforms and energy providers. And interestingly, these scores varied across customer segments, with the early adopters and innovators really wanting more features. So they were more inclined to give us a lower rating, even though we were, providing them with a lot of features, because they're open to much more control. And for the later majority, they were really very happy with just the improved reliability and the billing transparency and being able to pay much more easily. So their ratings were quite high. Next slide, thank you. And we also tested with our customers how they felt about different aspects of the platform. And generally speaking, they felt very well supported. We were able to achieve strong results for customer support, energy efficiency, installations, notifications, and overall engagement. Next slide, thanks. Village Energy currently has some contracts in India. We've got our pilot project in Andhra Pradesh. We've signed another contract with a sub-licensee in northern India, and we've got a pipeline of opportunities across India. Our expansion is obviously linked to easing of COVID-19 restrictions, but India still remains our most mature market and our clearest growth pathway. Next slide, thanks. I've just popped a link in here to our corporate video. I won't ask you to show it now, but you can maybe view it later when you've got time, or it can be quite easily found on YouTube. There's a Village Energy channel. If you search it, you should be able to find it. But The video here actually showcases the pilot project in Andhra Pradesh and includes some narrative from our corporate ambassador, cricketer Adam Gilchrist. So I'll finish up there, but I hope that I've been able to show to you how we're using technology in a quite a different way to help to improve outcomes for customers and the customer experience in the energy sector. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Yuan. That was our the co-founder and CEO of Village Energy. Thank you very much. Thank you for showing us the journey through Andhra Pradesh and all that we needed to know in terms of the trends that are emerging. I believe that there are a few people asking questions about the link. I'm going to say that we will share the link in the description, and we'll also make sure that if we find time, play this once when all the conversation's over. May I now request Priya Jadhav, the professor from IIT Bombay, to now take the virtual space, please.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen first. So yeah, good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you, Vishnu, for inviting me to this panel discussion, and I'm really glad to be here. So I'm going to be talking about the agricultural electricity consumer, and that's my area of work. I'm a professor at a department called the Center for Technology Alternatives for Rural Areas at IIT Bombay. And the work we do here is we train engineers in the field of development. So we have an MTech and PhD program, and we admit engineers from all backgrounds, and they get training in various development aspects, as well as an exposure to the technical aspects which are related to various aspects of rural development. So, okay, so let me get to the presentation. Also, I'd like to just say that I'm an electrical engineer. That's my educational background. And I've been working in this energy, water for agriculture sector for the last 5 to 6 years. I've been here at Sitara for the last 8 years. All right, so, so essentially the common narrative of agricultural electricity supply and what the consumers go through is very much tied to the fact that agricultural electricity supply is subsidized, and that affects the quality of supply because it leads to a situation where there's supposedly no incentive for the distribution utility to improve the supply quality. So what we've done is we've done a lot of work investigating what are the issues of quality of supply, which are generally well known to some extent, or they are out there about what the issues are and what are the causes and what can be done to improve it. And we find that there are lots of improvements which are possible to bring down the cost, which will help both utility and farmer. And these relate to various technical interventions as well as community interventions from the farmer's side. So I'd also like to say that the work that I'm presenting here is from a project done by IIT Bombay for the project on climate resilient agriculture. This is POCRA, being done by the Department of Agriculture and the Government of Maharashtra. Department of Agriculture of the Government of Maharashtra and the World Bank. So this is a project that's being implemented in 5,000 villages in the districts of Vidarbha and Marathwada. So this is, I should have shown the map of Maharashtra. So the map of Maharashtra is sort of, like this. And these are 15 districts out of the districts of, out of the 38 districts of Maharashtra. And these are the very drought-prone districts, Vidarbha and Marathwada. And so POCRA is being implemented in 5,000 of these villages to strengthen these villages against climate change and the changing rainfall patterns, etc. So the project, the PI for this project from IIT Bombay is Professor Milind Soni, a professor in the computer science department here, and I'm a co-PI. And I'm working on the energy aspect. We've been doing this since January 2020. However, the IIT Bombay POCRA water team, which is being led by Professor Milind Soni, and who is the PI on this project, has been working on this project since 2017. So they've been looking at water balance and water budgeting at the village level. So, all right, so then, so now what I'd like to show is that first, this is just a picture of the current situation of agricultural electricity supply and where there is room for improvement. That's what I'd like to just establish first. So, so power is supplied all over, almost all over India. It's supplied at daytime as well as nighttime for agriculture. And in Maharashtra, it's for 8 hours a day, which is also again common for many states of India. With the daytime supply for say 3 to 4 days out of the week, and nighttime for 3 to 4 days out of the week. In some locations, you also have 7 continuous days of nighttime supply and 7 continuous days of daytime supply. So now there are 2 types of data I'm showing here. One is a distribution transformer failure rate, and the other is the voltage supply. And both of these things affect the farmer a lot. So a distribution transformer is, it's, I think Yvonne also mentioned it, it's the last point where, it's where you get your, where the LT network start or the 240 volt network start, and you might have 25 to 30 farmers connected to one distribution transformer. If a distribution transformer fails, it can take anything from 8 days to 2 months to be repaired. And this is especially a problem because distribution transformer failure is very high. These are agricultural distribution transformers. The failure rate is very high in the peak season. And the peak season in Maharashtra happens in November, December. Essentially, you have the monsoon period, which starts in June, goes on till September. That's when farmers do a lot of rain-fed cropping with little bit of irrigation. But the moment that is over is when they start the rabi crops or the irrigated crops, and pumping is maximal in the November-December timeframe. And that's when a lot of failures happen, which means that there's a lot of crowding at the repair centers, and hence it can take very long. So if a distribution transformer fails and it's gone for say 2 weeks, that's a huge loss to the farmer because they can't irrigate for 2 weeks, which means the crop is definitely going to suffer. I mean, if the crop doesn't get irrigation beyond a certain point, after so many days, it is going to suffer. The yield is going to suffer. So distribution, this is one subdivision that we are looking at, and a subdivision is almost like a block. And the failure rate here is almost 30%. And this is not necessarily very high. There are other blocks where the failure rate is much higher. So this is a massive problem, and it's also expensive for the utility. The standard cost of repair that they have set as of now is 20,000 rupees. The right side shows voltages, and we metered 40 pumps starting from October 20 till the present. I mean, this is data till Jan 21, and you can see that out of the 40 pumps, 22 pumps had average voltage of less than 180 volts for 30% of the time. So very high. In fact, many of the pumps now in rural areas are set up such that they operate well even at low voltages. However, that of course it increases the inefficiency, but there's also a lot of pump tripping because of low voltages, and there's distribution transformer tripping. So in fact, the 8 hours of supply is not necessarily 8 hours, it may be even 6 hours with a lot of interruptions. So sorry, so this is to set the context. And I just want to say that a lot of these problems, in fact, are not are arising because the system is overloaded. That is, say the system, the one distribution transformer is designed to accommodate 22 farmers, but there may be 25 to 30 farmers. So there's a lot of unsanctioned loads, and that's what causes these problems. So one of the huge problems for consumers in this electricity supply is that they have very long wait times to get a legal connection. So this is just some data from one of the sections and from a subdivision. And these bars essentially show when the farmers have applied for a connection and they're still waiting. So essentially, this green color here, this long bar says that all these farmers are still waiting for a connection since this year, a paid pending connection. And this is when they applied but became paid pending here, which means that essentially without getting too much into the technicality, once consumers apply for a connection, they have to wait to get to the paid pending stage because there are a bunch of formalities to be done. And it's only once they get to the paid pending stage that they get onto that list of consumers waiting for a connection. So there are people who are even before the paid pending stage who are in fact waiting for a connection. So this is just to say that the number of consumers waiting for a connection is quite large, and they have to wait for 2 to 3 years. And no farmer is going to wait. If he has a water source, he's not going to wait for 2 to 3 years to start pumping. So then they do the hooking, and that's how the system gets overloaded. Okay. So there are various reasons why this backlog is there. There are right-of-way issues. There may be, sometimes the offices also run out of budget. In fact, in 2019, no applications were accepted in Pune section because the office ran out of budget. And of course, there are also farmers who don't want to apply for a connection. Now, this is important to understand that some farmers, there are always delinquent farmers who, there's one thing that's very common, that farmers have one legal connection, but they may have 2 wells and they will run the second well, on that same connection. So there is that problem. But on the other hand, there are many farmers who have access to water only for a short period in the Kharif season, or, only in a good rainfall year, they may in fact do Rabi cropping. And even then they may need only 2-3 irrigations, because if you're doing gram or pigeon pea, then tur, you only need a few irrigations. So they don't want to, they may be highly likely that those are the marginal farmers, because those farmers are always harder to identify, that they don't want to apply for a connection because they don't want to get that bill year after year. So it's quite important it may be important for MSCDCL to consider these farmers and do some kind of temporary connection arrangement where people are able to use the connection for a shorter while with some, because in any case, there are subsidies in the system. So we need to find a way to do this kind of thing. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to say was, so what I've been trying to say so far is that many of the problems that farmers are suffering and much of the cost to MSCDCL, like DT failure cost, is coming from the fact that infrastructure is insufficient. It's nothing to do with energy. So the farmers are still doing hooking and drawing the energy they need, and MSCDCL is still supplying that energy. But a lot of the costs are from infrastructure. And in fact, I have to say that the Maharashtra government has done a good job in a certain sense, because the electricity infrastructure for agriculture has in fact expanded a lot. However, there's a lot of room for efficiency to save both farmers a lot of pain and MSCDCL, the utility, a lot of cost. So one thing we suggested was that this infrastructure has grown over the years, and on an average, it costs MSCDCL 1 lakh of capital cost to supply an electricity connection to one farmer. So we said that we considered one village, and we did an exercise where we reorganized the infrastructure, the LT networks only in that village, and we included all the unconnected wells and the paid pending consumers. And that resulted in a per new connection cost of 30% of that. So about 28,000 rupees. So huge cost reduction. And also, it also resulted in better voltage and lesser loading on transformers for the existing consumers. Because these connections have come up over the years, the networks are now a little haphazard. So this kind of reorganization can benefit everyone and result in new connections. The other thing we said is that currently the way the number of connections are given out on our distribution transformer is just fixed. That is, one transformer has a rating of 100 kVA. So let's give out pumps to about 80% of that, rating. So till they may load it 100 kVA transformer to 80 kVA. However, not all farmers are pumping at the same time. So they can load it to a higher number depending on the cropping and irrigation that's prevalent in that region. So what that would do is make sure that there are a greater number of legal connections which can be connected. And then, of course, there's a problem of the connections who are waiting. But right now, what happens is that they limit it to a much smaller degree than needs to be with sanctioned consumers. And then the rest of it is all unsanctioned. Third, we did this, that right now capacitor usage is almost non-existent. And the capacitor is something that is an extremely low cost device. It costs a farmer only about 400 rupees. Once installed, it can last for 5 to 10 years. And it can reduce the load by 10 to 20%. So that's huge. It's important for farmers. It's also important for MSEDCL, not just for transformer failure, but even upstream. Essentially, improving the power factor, which is what the capacitor does, is very important for MSEDCL all around. And all it needs is awareness building with farmers. So we've done several experiments, and we know that farmers have many understandings with regard to capacitors. So we've done some things under POCRA. We've done a few things. We made a video, awareness building video, and we also we did some we held some meetings, and we didn't hold. I mean, the Department of Agriculture ensured that there were some meetings were held, and information distribution was held in various villages in under POCRA. However, we need a more concerted and a more community approach for this. Like right now, MSEDCL's approach is that if a DT failed, it will only be repaired if all farmers install capacitors. So all of their and they also have a rule that when a farmer gets a connection, he has to install a capacitor. But all of these interventions, or all of these approaches rather, are about enforcing, and that's not working. That cannot work because you can't go and check every farmer. Nobody's going to do it. It just doesn't happen. What you need here is awareness building to get the farmers to understand. So now our new pilot project that we are doing at a more intense level is to pick 3 feeders and hold meetings at the village level between Agriculture Department representative, MSEDCL representative, and the Sarpanch. And POCRA has a village committee. POCRA has formed a platform of a village committee for this climate change management. And we are using that platform to do awareness building along with Mahavitaran. I mean, we need this interdepartmental collaboration to make this happen. So the other thing we are trying to do, which is also a community action, is to form DT consumer groups. So these consumers essentially can sort of take care of the distribution transformers by doing things like implementing load management strategies. That is, not all farmers pump at the same time, because right now everyone pumps at the same time and nobody ends up getting 8 hours of full 8 hours of supply. So this kind of a load scheduling is what we are trying, based on the irrigation requirement with some kind of optimization, some basic optimization, and this is and some application development. So this is what we are trying in the current implementation, the new project MOU. Right. So this is some things that I wanted to present, that these government resolution policy for agricultural pump connections, essentially all of them are enforcement strategies. That is, field DTs will be repaired only if 80% have capacitors. Capacitors will be made available through notified vendors, and consumers will have to pay for them. However, making this happen is something that needs to be done at the local level. And that's something that is not happening right now. In all the government interventions, it's very top down, and there's not enough local, responsibilities. There are not enough local responsibilities, nor awareness, nor that action's not coming through. So this is what I wanted to say. So right now, farmers and MSEDCL, they are at loggerheads. The moment you talk to farmers, they have these problems with MSEDCL, and MSEDCL, MSEDCL is the utility in Maharashtra, and they have this problem with the farmers. But I have to also say that the local offices have a very different kind of an approach. And they, in fact, do understand what the farmers need, and they try to work with them. They do what's best within their purview. However, the local offices are not given enough responsibility or authority or incentivization also. We are trying this capacitor intervention through the local offices without the main office. And we get a very positive response from them because they know that this is going to be useful for them too. I mean, they feel that. So, and they do understand the farmers, they understand what the farmers' needs are, and they try to accommodate them as best as possible. So I guess this interaction between farmers and MSCDCL needs to be improved. There's a high degree of unknowns and a lack of formalization. For instance, lack of network diagrams. What's the true extent of the load on the DT? What is the extent of latent demand or the connections which are pending? And farmer behavior obviously contributes to this through hooking, excess loads, and unpaid bills. And so essentially, we are proposing here a technical as well as community action to improve efficiency in the system, which will benefit both parties. So, right. So thank you. That's what I have.
Thank you very much. So we had Priya Yadav from IIT Bombay giving us this much needed insight from about agriculture and rural consumers angle. May I now request Vishnu to give us a brief on this.
Hi. Thanks, Priya, Johan, and Mahesh. After seeing all your presentations, I'm just trying to figure out in my mind what should be my structure of what I should say. I will start with CAG's experience. I don't have a presentation. I'll start with CAG's experience on the electricity sector. CAG has always focused on giving out our information to the consumers in terms of information dissemination strategies. We build a lot of capacity of consumers in different consumer categories. We also try to build knowledge products and tools, and also within an initiative of CAG, we do a lot of advisory services for consumers, especially on the electricity issues. So just packaging that, we have set up something called electricity consumer cells in the 7 districts of Tamil Nadu, whose only job is to provide what I told just now in terms of giving advisory services. We have given around 3,000 advisory services on across different consumer categories, right from the agricultural consumer to the domestic consumer. We don't go for the high tension industrial consumers, but we like to stick ourselves to that bottom of the pyramid of the low tension consumers. What we do basically is that when a consumer comes in with a complaint, the idea is that consumers do not know about the sector and they need to be handheld for any of their issues to be resolved. The consumer cell takes the complaint and then liaises with the utility to resolve the complaint. It could be as simple as what Priya was saying about an application being pending and what is the status of the application. In terms of Johan's thing, in terms of the metering position, if the meter is not in play, is not being given on time, then what should the consumer do to get this resolved? So the documentation, the application, the various processes by which these consumers can get these things on time is something what these consumer cells focuses on. So we are doing it we have initiated this from 2016 onwards, and we have reached out to over 7,000 consumers in Tamil Nadu. We have resolved around 3,000 complaints so far. It is across several consumer categories, like I said, in terms of domestic, places of worship, agriculture consumers, town panchayats, which have a problem, it's also commercial establishments, people who face in terms of what kind of complaints were resolved, metering, infrastructure, voltage fluctuations. We've even managed to put a transformer in one of the villages which had major problems. We have resolved a number of agricultural complaints that have come in. We have also looked at, there has been a whole bunch of load shedding across Tamil Nadu for some time. Then we have looked into why this load shedding has happened, and in fact, putting a new pole, putting new cable lines. These are all things that the electricity consumer cells have done over the years. That that's one aspect of the sector, I think, that we need to look at. If we see that consumer experience, if it needs to be enhanced, they need to be handheld. They need to be aware of what the sectoral rules and regulations are and what processes they need to follow. I think that's one part of it. But in terms of the regulation, I think consumers need to be aware or need to have the understanding of the information, the distribution standards of performance. The distribution standards of performance is kind of the thing that binds the utility and the consumer in terms of the efficiency standards that the utility needs to adhere to for giving services. So a meter, if it needs to be put in, it has got to be put in let's say a month's time or a week's time. That's something that the regulator puts in place. These regulations are in place. I think recently it has been consolidated and put as electricity consumer protection rules by the Ministry of Power. So each state has its own distribution standards of performance. For example, Maharashtra will have a clear standards of performance on various aspects of what the services that with the electricity the distribution licensee provides. So this is another part of it. But the idea is that, as you know, as Johan said there, and Mahesh was talking about the evolution of the sector. The sector is moving quite fast. We've got archaic regulations there in terms of having to do certain things at certain points of time, failing which fines will be paid, imposed on the utility, and you have to get and consumers are entitled for some kind of money from the utility if they don't provide the service. But at the same time, the role of smart meters, that's something that's coming up that will possibly enhance the experience of consumers in terms of gaining knowledge, in terms of understanding the position of where they are in terms of the dynamic kind of a dynamic consumption pattern, for example, like Johan was talking about. So these are things that are evolving, but the regulations that need to enhance the consumer's experience in the sector is something that we need to probably look at in terms of trying to figure out if a smart meter is put, then what are the kind of information that the consumer needs to have, and how simplified and how well informed is like, for example, one of CAG's projects is to create an electricity bill, a model electricity bill for a consumer to get his ideas around the sector and how he can participate better in the sector. An informed electricity bill will enable him to do that. So those are things that come out of the second part of it, which in terms of the standards and distribution performance. But the last thing is the grievance redressal mechanism. The grievance on where the consumer needs to go to resolve his complaints. I've spoken about the electricity consumer cells. That's on one side of the story, but within the utility, you do have electricity consumer grievance redressal mechanisms. So those mechanisms are basically within the Electricity Act, and those are they are grievance mechanisms within the utility where consumers can approach and get their information resolved. But the idea then is that it brings me back to Johan's point about if I'm able to enhance consumers' experience at the consumer's end in terms of giving them the information, the right level of knowledge, giving a lot of grievances that we see going to the utility can be reduced, and and whatever that we see as consumers being unable to resolve a lot of differences, probably in terms of Priya's sake, there could be a couple of things that could be done possibly by the utility themselves. They have the farmers, and they have the right level of information. So that's the third bit of the whole equation that we need to look at in terms of grievance redressal and the escalations for grievance in terms of the ombudsman. What kind of regulations are we then looking at? So that's something that needs to be looked into. I think these three pillars are something that in terms of information, and at the end of the day, I think we need to look at the way, if it is 24/7, reliable, affordable power is what, and quality power is what we are getting. I think that's my I think that's about it. Thanks. So, Pavitra, we can go for the Q&A. I think Yohan needs to leave by 12:30. She's got a hard stop. Yeah.
Sure. So maybe I'd start by asking a question to Yuvan. The question that I do have is about the digital prepayment that you were speaking about. I'm very curious about trying to understand how this, if that particular feature of your initiative was implemented in the Andhra Pradesh project, and if it did, how did it go? Like, was there uptake in?
Yeah, I can speak about that. Can you still hear me okay before I answer that question? Yeah, good. We were actually really concerned about whether consumers would embrace prepayments. We assumed that it would be something that they would struggle to move across to, because obviously they were all on post payment. But what we found was that they really embraced it, and they were really receptive to it because it was coupled with a much greater visibility of their energy spend. So they were able to see exactly what they were spending on energy via the app. And then they were able to receive things like notifications when balance was getting low. And we don't, with the prepayment, there's no restriction on when they can pay and the increments of payment. So, consumers that maybe don't have a huge amount of income can choose to make smaller payments much more regularly, which suited them a lot better. So we actually found that there was a really strong uptake of prepayment, even with customers that weren't using the app, because we allowed customers to take cash to a local store, like a kiosk, or, we also allow any smartphone owner to do top-ups on behalf of someone else. So as long as they've got the QR code for the meter, they can apply a credit to any meter they want to, and we can just use one-time passwords for authentication. So it was actually quite popular, and we were able to demonstrate a really strong uptake.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that kind of, that was the main question I had, since you brought it up with Andhra Pradesh specifically and in a rural region. So thank you. Do we have any other questions for Yuvan specifically? I did see a hand raised, Mr. Amandan Kasturi. Do you have a question?
That could be, he may have pressed it by mistake.
Okay.
I'm right. He's been doing it for a long time.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to direct one other question to Mr. Mahesh. I wanted to speak about, you speak about all the things that a consumer needs to know, and that, of course, there is the consumer bills, which is the primary way in which, discoms communicate, and the demand charges are going to be there. But what are the line of communications you think is going to, make the future? Because clearly right now there is a lack of communication, effective communication in this sector.
I think the line of communication obviously needs to come from some level of decentralization of this messaging and some kind of an interaction that can happen between the service provider, in this case being the electricity utility, and the consumers. And obviously the role played by CAG and several other organizations becomes very vital. And I just want to sort of re-emphasize on either the village energies experience or Priya's deliberations related to how the farmers feel about the electricity provision and the problems that they face. I think it's very clear that unless you have that kind of a constant contact point between the service provider at the local level and those who are actually consuming the electricity, this is not really going to happen. So the local problems are need to be well understood. So I think in monopolistic sort of utility behavior. If you're sitting at the capital city of the state, and if you try to control what's happening in the farthest service delivery point in your network, I think it's sort of too much to ask, even from the policymaker side, and too much to gain, even too little to gain, even from the consumer's perspective. So, Pavitra, in short, I feel the communication needs to come from multiple channels. One is the local offices of the distribution company. They need to reach out to people firstly. Secondly, you need to also have some kind of a community enterprise created at the village level to interact with the distribution licensee representatives at the local level, and also for them to take some kind of collective actions. And then the role of the civil society and the local cooperatives and the local consumer groups cannot be emphasized more. I think they are so vital to this entire process. Pavitra?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Mahesh. I'm going to bring in Ms. Yvonne on this and just want to ask you about Village Energy's experience in Andhra Pradesh around this line of communication and how it went in the community space.
Well, we obviously with our pilot, we engaged a lot with the community. We initially established what we called a project implementation committee, which consisted of representatives of the different community groups in the village. We used that obviously to disseminate information about the project. We also engaged with local small businesses, with local schools, just to build awareness. But I think there's been a few points made today as well about just the engagement that happens from a DISCOM perspective at that local level. And I think a lot of consumers are quite frustrated with an inability to get information or to get timely support from their DISCOMs, and quite often it is the people at the local level that have those much stronger connections. And I think by coupling that with the kinds of technologies that we've developed, where we have interfaces that can be used to really assess the state of a local system, to answer technical questions, but also be able to provide notifications and communications via an app, which can then obviously be communicated throughout the community quite easily. I think it is a vital aspect of just customer satisfaction and customer experience more broadly when it comes to an energy system.
Okay, thank you. And one other question I did have about the project was also that there was focus on smart metering. I know that. Was there an angle of smart grid as well that was incorporated in these?
Well, the smart meter itself actually provides control, and we install the smart meter at it's effectively a metering and control device. So it's like an IoT device, and it gets installed not just at the points of consumption, which is obviously the residential households, but every point of supply. So if there are any rooftop solar systems or any battery systems that are connected to the grid, they also have one of the devices installed, as well as a device at the transformer. So the complete flow of energy through the system is monitored through the platform, and at any given time the platform and those devices are trained to prioritize lower cost sources such as solar and balance supply and demand. So there is a grid automation component to the solution, and that's really important when we think about some of the things that we've been discussing today around transformer overload. Obviously, if there's a peak event happening on a system, if you can shed load in a way that is intelligent, so you can target lower priority loads and shed those first, which is what our platform does, it removes a lot of those outages and a lot of those instances of overload. So we were able to demonstrate that through the platform as well. So yes, it is not just a smart metering device, it's also a smart grid device as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that. If we have any more questions, can we have people raising their hands? While we still have people probably waiting to raise or being shy to raise the hand, I'm going to have one more question to Mr. Mahesh. My question to you, I mean, it might be, it goes beyond the scope of what you were speaking today, especially since you spoke about SME clusters and how they operate and the RE and E combination over there. I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit about blockchain and how that can come into this kind of a cluster scenario.
I think if you really look at the ladder of technology applications, if you talk to engineers who have been working in the field past like 50 years, 60 years, their brains, in my opinion, work as much as a blockchain can give you any insights for. Okay, but the system is obviously sort of changing. Blockchain is just one sort of method to create some kind of a distributed ledger in order to capture whatever changes that are being done by whoever is participating in that ledger and that kind of an activity. So I would say even before we reach the blockchain, we actually need to understand some fundamentals, and these fundamentals are good metering, right kind of metering, understanding the power quality, be it SME cluster or even an agriculture feeder. And there is a lot of intelligence that one can start creating if you start analyzing the data from the field, from the smart meters, for example, by way of applying some machine learning algorithms to understand what kinds of anomalies that we are seeing, what kind of correlations we are seeing in the production capacities of the SMEs and the electricity consumption, the power quality, how is it really impacting the production itself, and so on. And artificial intelligence, one can actually look at some kind of a predictions to be created based on the prior knowledge. So Pavitra, I feel applying blockchain in the current situation definitely offers good opportunities, but my real question is it really needed? Are we there yet? My sort of submission and suggestion would be for us to start capturing the energy consumption data, where the energy is being used, and sort of making a good sense of simple automation system and capturing where we are, when we are generating the electricity, how it is being used, so on and so forth, and really sort of creating some kind of an objective for that feeder. So I'll make one more point and then pause. It's important for us to understand how the SME cluster is functioning. It could be some kind of one single industry type, such as say textiles or the pulp and paper industry cluster, which is operating together. So their usage patterns could be very similar. But if you have some kind of a heterogeneous SME cluster, you have excellent opportunities. And I would like to give one example from Pune, wherein outskirts of Pune, in the Hadassar industrial estate, there were food processing industries, textile industries, machining industries. And the objective function that was created jointly along with the utility service providers as well as the owners of those units was basically to create a situation where you do not really load the transformer beyond 65%. So that was the objective. And in order to meet that objective, there were really interesting things that the food processing industries and the textile as well as the machining industries were able to do. So instead of starting all of your pumps, simply put, if instead of starting all of your pumping operations and the motive power at the same time, if you could simply stagger that load in different time zones, you will be able to get your product that you want out of your factory. At the same time, you will make sure that you're not creating any kind of surges on the transformers. And the same thing can even be applied even in the agriculture feeder, wherein instead of starting all the motors at the same time, can you really stagger the load? So, so I would say blockchain is sort of a good jargon, but my question is, are we really utilizing the knowledge that we already have? And can we sort of build certain analytics based on meter readings and understanding the anomalies in the meter readings and predicting and doing some kind of interesting matching between the renewable energy generation and the load side of things, instead of directly jumping to a blockchain which is typically used for trading purposes and the peer-to-peer trading purposes. Pavitra, back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, especially since there's so much buzz about it. I thought that trying to understand the relevance in this angle might be very helpful. So thank you for sharing this with us. And since you specifically spoke about load shedding and then the timings as well, so I'm going to try and bring in Professor Priya, who spoke about how the motors are run at different times. I'm just trying to understand how the community work in this specific aspect work. Like how could you manage the community to come together and fix upon certain timings?
Yeah, Pavitra, so this is a intervention that we have planned for the MOU that the new project that the new phase that we've entered into. So it's not something we've implemented yet, but we've had preliminary discussions with farmers, and it's a fairly complex thing. It's an experiment, really. Based on, we do need to keep a whole bunch of things in mind. That is that, the fact is that there are still farmers who, they are not necessarily using it for 8 hours a day, every day. Even in the daytime, there are these 3 or 4 daytime days, which are the most precious, and then the nighttime. Because many farmers don't want to pump at night, rightly so, because they live several kilometers from the field. Just going into the fields at night is not an easy job. And really, when they are irrigating, the farmers have to be in the field, especially for furrow irrigation. Like if it's sprinkler or drip, they can turn on the water and leave. But if it is surface irrigation, furrow irrigation or border irrigation, they have to stand in the field. They stand in the field and make sure that the water is flowing right and all that. So nighttime is very hard. So yeah, we still have to try it. So it's a matter of optimizing, running some optimization algos on our computers and coming up with the best solution possible. The best solution will be suboptimal in the sense that the voltages may not be good. We have to work with what they tell us, and that's that. And the voltages may still not be great, but that's the best. So yeah, it's still an experiment. And what Mahesh said about staggering, there's farmers use this auto starter for their pumps. So when the pumps start up, there is a starting current. And so if everyone starts at the same time, there is a huge load on the system, which creates trouble. Now, when farmers leave their pumps on to run at night, that is, so many farmers do transfer water from borewell into dugwell, which they have to, because directly from the borewell is infeasible for the irrigation practice directly into the field because the flow rate is low. So many of them transfer from borewell into dugwell and then into their fields. So if it's going to come on, if the power is going to come on at 10 in the night, they turn this, there's this auto starter which just turns on the pump as soon as the power comes. So now those auto starters do have a stagger mechanism from 1 to 4 minutes. So it is possible to get them to make sure that they all make their settings a little bit differently so that there's no excess load. However, that depends on the situation. This is not the case in every village. I mean, this kind of auto starter usage and stuff. So yes, bringing the farmers together is going to be hard. But I think the main thing, one of the things that would be easy to bring them together is on the use of capacitors. If all the 25-30 farmers on the distribution transformers use capacitors, that itself reduces the load by 15 to 20%. So that's something they can do. Whether the load management works or not is something that remains to be seen.
So Priya, just to share, I think through the ECCs, through the presence in the districts in Tamil Nadu, we can do something around it. If you have any materials to share with us, please do. Be happy to take it forward. Yeah. Thanks.
So the capacitor, sure, we can discuss it later.
Yeah, later. I think that's about it, Pavitra. I think it's already past 10 minutes past the 12:30 mark. Yeah, let's wind up. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to give the vote of thanks and then we?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, thanks, Mahesh, Priya, and Yuan, for coming in quick. No, we've been like talking about this for over a month, and we have, somehow it comes down to this webinar. I hope we can take this conversation forward. And I'd like to thank the other participants who have joined to